"Don't take my braid!" Wikasa's voice cracked like a branch underfoot, sharp and desperate, as his small fists clenched the edge of the chair that had been dragged into the middle of the schoolroom like a whipping post. The long iron scissors hovered above his head, blades opening with a screech that sounded louder than the church bell, every metallic scrape cutting through the silence of 30 children frozen at their benches. The missionary teacher's hand, bony and pale, pressed hard against the back of the boy's neck, forcing him to bow as though in prayer, though there was no mercy in the man's grip. The strap at his belt dangled ready, promising pain if the child moved again. Wikasa's braid hung forward, thick and black, tied with a strip of red cloth his mother had knotted that morning with trembling hands. That braid was more than hair. It was memory, pride, a rope to his ancestors, and every child watching seemed to know it, even if they dared not speak. The teacher's voice boomed. "This pagan filth must be shorn. Civilization cannot grow on wild roots." And he lifted the scissors higher, the sun from the window catching their edge until they flashed like a blade meant for execution. Wikasa gasped, his eyes burning with tears, and the words came again, louder, his throat raw. "Don't take my braid." The room shuddered with his cry, though the children did not move, their eyes locked forward, their small hands gripping desks until knuckles turned white. Just then, the door burst open with a slam that made dust rain from the rafters, and Nape Wynn stormed inside, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her breath ragged from running, her dark hair loose from its braid. She shoved past the missionary, her skirts trailing mud from the yard, and in 3 strides her hand was on her son's braid, wrapping it so tightly that the color drained from her knuckles. The teacher spun on her, his face red, spittle flying as he barked, "Woman, you will sit down or you will be thrown out. He must be cleansed. His braid is heathen." But her voice rose, breaking yet unbroken, a voice that filled the corners of the room and pressed into every listening ear. This braid is not only his, it carries his father's hair, woven in before the war, before the cough and the blood took him from us. The words dropped like stones, and for a moment even the teacher froze, the scissors shaking so badly the blades grazed a strand, but cut nothing. Wikasa's sobs caught in his chest. His small fingers clutching his mother's skirt, wide eyes blinking in shock because he had never been told. A gasp ran through the benches. Some of the children looked down quickly, others dared to glance at the teacher with silent accusation. The missionary's face twitched, his authority slipping under the weight of her revelation, but he tried again, his voice hoarse. "Sentiment does not change the law. Hair must be cut." Yet his hand trembled as he raised the scissors, and everyone saw it. Nape Wynn bent, pressing her forehead to her son's crown, her voice low but firm enough to carry. "I will not let them take what is his, Wikasa. I will not let them take your father." Her vow rang louder than the bell, louder than the clatter of scissors, and in that moment the air in the schoolhouse shifted. Heavy not with fear, but with the first fragile breath of defiance. Even the smallest children felt it, the sense that one woman's grip could hold back the blade of a world trying to cut them away. The scissors quivered, but they did not close, and for the first time it was not the missionary's command, but the mother's defiance that ruled the room. The silence did not last. It shattered with the heavy rhythm of boots outside, the stomp of authority marching closer, and the door burst inward to reveal 2 soldiers in blue coats, their rifles slung, bayonets glinting with the same merciless shine as the scissors still trembling in the teacher's hand. Dust swirled in with them, and the children shrank in their benches, their eyes darting from steel to braid to mother, afraid that the world had suddenly grown too sharp to survive. The teacher straightened, his face pale, but voice regaining its edge now that muscle stood behind his command. "Remove her," he barked, pointing at Nape Wynn, whose hands still clamped fiercely around her son's braid. "She defies the law of the state and the word of the church. Take her outside and make the boy submit." One soldier stepped forward, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the floor as though ashamed to meet her gaze, while the other sneered openly, his hand already reaching for her arm. Wicasa cried out, wrapping his thin arms around her waist, his body shaking as he pressed against her, the plea breaking raw from his throat. "Don't let them, Ina, don't let them." The soldier's fingers closed on her shoulder, but she twisted, her shawl tearing loose, her voice rising like a storm breaking across the plains. "You cut this braid. You cut a dead man's memory. You cut a father from his son." Her words rang through the wooden walls, shaking even the dust motes in the sunlight. And the soldier's hand faltered, his grip loosening. The other soldier barked, "Orders are orders," and shoved past his comrade, seizing her wrist hard enough to bruise. Still, she did not let go of the braid. Her fingers locked, her body bending like iron, refusing to break. The children gasped, some clapping their hands over their mouths, others whispering prayers in Lakota, words they had been punished for speaking, but now dared to let slip. Wicasa's eyes streamed, his cheek pressed to the braid caught in her fist, as if by holding it with her he too was resisting the steel. The teacher snapped his fingers, urging the soldiers forward. "Hold her steady. If she will not release it, I will cut through her hand." Gasps ripped through the room, but before he could raise the scissors again, one of the soldiers, young, freckles visible even beneath the brim of his cap, spoke low, his voice cracking. "Sir, they said we were sent to make them learn. They never said we were to dishonor their dead." His words landed heavy, shame thick in the air. And the other soldier cursed, yanking him back, muttering that mercy was weakness. But the hesitation spread like cracks in ice, the children leaning forward, their eyes no longer only afraid, but glimmering with something fragile and dangerous. Nape Wynn, still gripping the braid, looked from soldier to soldier, her chest heaving, and though her arms shook, she said again, louder than before, "This braid carries a father's spirit. If you cut it, you kill him twice." The scissors wavered, the teacher's hand trembling so badly that the blades clicked uselessly in the air, and the bayonets, sharp and ready a moment before, hung idle in the stale light. In that breathless hush, the battle line was drawn, not only in the dust of the floorboards, but in the hearts of everyone who saw, a line between obedience and conscience, cruelty and memory. And as Wicasa clung to his mother's side, the whole room knew the choice was no longer only hers. It belonged to every eye that dared to keep watching. The standoff in the schoolhouse did not stay within its four walls. By afternoon, the story had spilled into the dust of the street, carried on the lips of children who ran to their mothers, carried in the whispers of men leaning outside the blacksmith's shop, carried even in the hasty stride of the sheriff as he was summoned by the teacher's complaint. Dusthaven had always swallowed such things, cut braids, lost tongues, silent cries. But this time the silence cracked, and by sundown the square had gathered with eyes sharp and voices clashing. The missionary teacher stood on the steps of the chapel, waving the scissors like a relic, his face red as he proclaimed before the crowd, "This woman resists the law of God and of man. She places pagan hair above the discipline of her child." Murmurs rippled, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably, unwilling to meet the gaze of the Lakota mother who stood in the square, her son clutched close, the braid still safe beneath her hand. The sheriff cleared his throat, badge gleaming though his eyes did not, and muttered that order must be preserved, that no town could afford defiance in the schoolhouse. yet his words sounded thinner than the cry that had rung that morning. "Don't take my braid," a cry every child in town had repeated before dinner, and now the mothers shifted restlessly, hearing in Wikasa's plea an echo of their own children's fear. Nape Wyn's voice rose, raw from hours of repeating her vow, but strong still, carrying over the murmurs. "This is not only hair. This is his father's spirit, bound in blood and memory. You ask him to forget a man who died for him. What lesson do you teach when you strip a child of his father?" The crowd hushed, shame settling like dust, though a few ranchers muttered that savages clung to old ways, that the boy must learn to be civilized if he was to survive. Yet even as they spoke, their voices faltered, because every mother there saw the boy's small hand gripping his braid. Every father saw the way the soldier had flinched from striking her, and it was harder now to pretend they did not understand. The teacher raised the scissors high, crying that law demanded sacrifice, that without submission there could be no unity. But his hand shook, and the metal caught the light in a way that made it look more like a blade for slaughter than a tool of learning. Whispers turned to words, words to shouts. And suddenly the town was not only judging her, they were judging themselves, caught between the comfort of obedience and the mirror of her defiance. A man near the back shouted, "Leave them be!" and another cursed him for weakness, and in the space of a heartbeat the square became two towns, divided not by fences but by conscience. Wikasa pressed closer to his mother, trembling, yet his eyes wide and shining, for he felt the shift too, the tremor of power moving from those who held the scissors to those who refused to look away. And in that moment, as the last rays of sun bled over the rooftops, Dusthaven understood that the question was no longer whether the braid would be cut. It was whether the town itself would dare watch the blade fall. The morning after the square divided, the school bell tolled as it always had. But the sound rang hollow, for every child who trudged up the steps carried in their eyes the memory of Wikasa's cry and his mother's hand locked around his braid. The missionary teacher paced the schoolhouse like a caged wolf, the scissors glinting on his desk, his temper sharpened by the sheriff's lukewarm support and the town's whispers of shame. He barked orders for the children to sit, to fold their hands, to recite the lessons, but his voice carried less weight than it had before, because every time his gaze fell on Wikasa, who sat tall with his braid still whole, the silence in the room thickened. When the bell rang for recess, the children spilled into the yard, but instead of chasing marbles or tossing sticks, they gathered in small knots. Their whispers fierce, their eyes darting toward the classroom door. A girl no older than 9 lifted her chin, her braid swaying as she declared in a hush, "If they cut his, they will cut mine, but I will not let go." Another boy, his hair already cropped short, pressed his hand to his bare neck, shame burning his cheeks as he whispered, "I had no one to hold mine, but I will stand when they come for the next." The whispers grew until they were not whispers at all, until a chorus of children murmured in defiance, their small hands clutching each other's braids, their eyes alive with a spark that no strap or scissors could fully quench. Inside, Nape Wyn knelt by the stove where she had been allowed to sit, her shawl drawn close, listening to the sound of children daring to remember their fathers, their songs, their names, and her heart beat with a fierce rhythm of pride and terror. The missionary burst out, furious, demanding silence, shouting that this rebellion would doom them all, but his words cracked in the air like whips that had lost their sting. One by one, the children refused to line up for inspection, refused to step onto the chair, their voices breaking but steady as they echoed Wikasa's plea. "Don't take my braid." The soldiers, summoned again, lingered at the doorway, their rifles heavy, their faces harder than yesterday, Yet even among them there were cracks. One shifted uneasily, his gaze dropping as he muttered that he had a sister with hair just as long. The missionary seized Wicasa by the arm, dragging him toward the chair, but the boy kicked and shouted, clinging to his mother's shawl, and before the scissors could rise, half a dozen children surged forward, small bodies wrapping around him, a wall of fragile defiance. Their braids tangled together, hands gripping cloth and hair, and the sight struck the room with a force no sermon could match. "This is lawlessness!" the teacher shrieked, his face purple with rage, but his voice was drowned by the pounding of 30 small hearts beating as one, and the sound of their vow, unwritten, unspoken, but carried in every trembling hand, that no braid would be cut without a fight. In that moment, the schoolhouse ceased to be a place of discipline and became something else entirely. A battlefield not of rifles and cannons, but of memory against erasure, of mothers' tears against men's commands, of children who had decided they would no longer bow their heads. And though the sheriff hovered, torn between badge and conscience, and the soldiers stood uncertain, the truth had already taken root. The braid was no longer just Wicasa's. It was theirs, and it would not be surrendered quietly. By midday, the schoolhouse had become a furnace of tension, the air thick with sweat, chalk dust, and the stubborn rhythm of small hearts refusing to bow. The missionary teacher, driven half-mad by defiance, stormed from desk to desk shouting scripture like curses, waving the scissors as if the clink of steel could drown the children's vows. But each time he demanded obedience, the whispers grew stronger, children clutching their braids, boys and girls alike, the sound of "don't take it" rising like a chant that scraped his ears raw. At last, red-faced and trembling, he struck the bell hard enough to crack it and strode into the yard, his voice booming as he called for the sheriff and the soldiers. "If the hair cannot be cut, then the children themselves must be taken," he roared, and his words spilled into the square where townsfolk lingered, pretending at chores but straining to hear. Gasps rose from mothers clutching younger ones to their skirts, fathers tightening fists at their sides, for everyone understood the meaning. If a mother's grip could keep the scissors at bay, then the state would break her by removing her child altogether. The sheriff hesitated, his jaw working, eyes flicking from the crowd to the soldiers, for even his badge quailed at such cruelty. Yet Barnaby Holt, a rancher whose voice always leaned toward cruelty, spat in the dust and shouted, "Better they be raised clean than left savage. Send them away." A murmur of assent rippled among those who feared shame more than justice, but others cried out against him, women weeping, men cursing, the square dividing sharper than ever. Inside, Nape Wynne felt the threat like a knife against her throat, for she knew too well the wagons that had come before, the wheels creaking under stolen children, the sound of mothers chasing until their lungs broke. Wicasa clung to her braid now, his small fingers desperate, his voice hoarse. "They'll take me, Ina. Don't let them take me." She pressed his head to her chest, whispering fiercely, "They will not. As long as I breathe, they will not." Yet her words trembled, for she knew breath was not always enough. The soldiers shifted uneasily, the younger one pale, whispering to his sergeant that he had not signed on to drag children from their mothers. But the older soldier barked that orders were orders, and orders would be obeyed. The missionary returned, pointing at Wicasa, his hand trembling but his voice shrill with triumph. "Tonight the wagon will come. This defiance ends when he is gone." The words cracked across the room, and the children gasped as though struck. But then something unexpected stirred. One child after another rose from their benches, braids swaying, voices breaking but steady as they echoed Wicasa's cry. "Don't take mine! Don't take mine!" The chant grew, thin voices weaving into a wall of sound, and the scissors clattered to the floor, useless against such a tide. The missionary staggered back, horrified, as if facing not children but a storm he could not contain. In that moment the braid ceased to be a strand of hair. It became a banner, a line drawn, a promise that if they tried to take one, they would have to silence them all. And outside, in the gathering dusk, the townsfolk felt the weight of choice pressing heavier than ever, to stand with the mothers and children, or to let the wagons roll in and carry their shame forever. Night crept over Dusthaven with a weight that pressed on every door and window, the sun's last embers swallowed by clouds that carried no stars, only the low groan of wind that seemed to warn what was coming. Mothers huddled their children close. Fathers sat stiff in their chairs with rifles laid across their knees, but none dared speak aloud the dread that had settled since the missionary's decree. The schoolhouse stood dark, its bell cracked and silent, yet all eyes turned toward its shape as if waiting for it to toll an execution. Then came the sound, faint at first but undeniable. Wheels crunching over dry earth, iron rims grinding against stone, the whinny of horses pulling weight heavy with intent. The wagon rolled into the square, its boards high-sided like a moving prison. Lanterns swaying from the corners casting long shadows that danced over the faces of those who watched from porches and alleys. Soldiers rode at its flanks, their bayonets gleaming like teeth in the flicker of light, and at the reins sat the missionary, his jaw clenched, the scissors hanging from his belt as though they were a badge of victory. He shouted into the night, his voice cracking but triumphant, "Bring out the boy! Bring out the mother who defies the law! Tonight Dusthaven will learn obedience!" The words echoed off the clapboard walls, and a shudder rippled through the crowd, some shrinking back into their doorways, others stepping forward as if compelled by something stronger than fear. Inside one cabin, Nape Wynn pressed Wicasa to her chest, his braid wrapped tight in her fist, his tears soaking her dress. He whispered, "They've come, Ina." His voice barely more than breath, and she answered with a vow she had spoken until her throat bled. "As long as I stand, they will not have you." She rose, shawl clutched tight, her steps heavy yet unshaken as she pushed open the door. The crowd parted as she walked into the square, her son at her side, his small hand gripping her skirt, his eyes wide with terror but also with the strange glow of courage he had not known he carried. Gasps spread as the soldiers dismounted, moving to seize them, but then from the far side of the square came a voice sharp and loud. It was the blacksmith, his arm still bound from the bullet Barnaby had fired weeks before, his hammer clutched in his good hand. "You will not take them," he said, stepping into the lantern light. Behind him moved his daughter, braids swaying, tears on her cheeks but fire in her eyes. The missionary barked at the sheriff to restore order, but the sheriff did not move, his badge gleaming dull as if it weighed him down. Instead, more voices rose, one by one, mothers crying, fathers gritting their teeth, children clutching each other's braids. "You will not take them," they repeated, louder, until it swelled into a chant that shook the very boards beneath their feet. The soldiers hesitated, their rifles heavy in hands that suddenly felt weaker, their eyes darting to one another as if waiting for someone else to move first. Wicasa clung to his mother, trembling, but for the first time he saw the crowd not as judges but as a shield, and his heart beat with the wild hope that maybe, just maybe, the braid would survive the night. The missionary's face twisted with fury as the chant rolled through the square, louder with every breath, a tide he could not dam with scripture or steel, and his voice cracked as he shrieked above the roar, "Seize them! Do your duty! Take the boy and silence this rebellion!" The soldiers shifted, their bayonets glinting in the lantern light, their horses stamping nervously at the thunder of voices that shook the night, and one finally spurred forward, dismounting with rifle in hand, his boots crunching the gravel as he reached for Wikasa's arm. The boy cried out, clutching tighter to his mother's skirt, and Nape Wynn planted her feet in the dirt, her hand clamped around the braid as if she could tether her son to the earth itself. The soldier's fingers closed around the boy's sleeve, but before he could pull, the blacksmith swung his hammer down onto the rifle barrel, the clang ringing like a church bell shattering, sparks flying as the weapon clattered to the ground. Gasps tore through the crowd, a moment of stunned silence, then a wave of movement as men and women surged forward, not with rifles drawn, but with farm tools, stones, even bare fists, their bodies forming a wall between the wagon and the mother with her child. "Stand down!" the missionary screamed, his voice shrill, his face red, but the sheriff raised his hand weakly as though to command, then let it fall useless to his side, for the tide had risen beyond his reach. Another soldier leapt down, drawing his pistol, but the blacksmith's daughter darted in, clutching Wikasa's braid along with his mother, her voice breaking but strong as she shouted, "You cannot cut them all!" The words cracked open the fear that had bound the children, and suddenly they were everywhere, braids swaying, hands clutching, voices rising until the chant became a storm. "Don't take mine! Don't take mine!" The soldier hesitated, pistol shaking, as a boy no older than 8 stood before him, trembling yet defiant, his bare feet planted in the dust, his braid clutched in both fists as though it were a shield. The lanterns flickered wildly, casting shadows that made the square seem filled with twice as many children, twice as many mothers, until the soldiers faltered under the sheer weight of eyes refusing to look away. The missionary, spittle flying, raised his scissors high as if he alone could cut the Defiance down, but his hand shook so badly that the blades snapped shut on empty air, and laughter rippled bitter and scornful from the crowd, a sound sharper than any sermon. Rage blinded him, and he lunged forward, but the sheriff stepped at last into his path, his pistol drawn not at the crowd, but at the very man he had been meant to protect. "No more," the sheriff said, his voice hoarse but steady. "No child leaves tonight, not by your hand." The words struck like a hammer blow, and the soldiers froze, caught between orders and conscience, their rifles lowering inch by inch. Wikasa's braid swung heavy in the lamplight, safe still beneath his mother's hand, and as he clung to her side, his small voice rose in the silence that followed, cracked and trembling but clear. "Don't take my braid." And for the first time, the words were not a plea, but a command. Echoed by every throat around him until the square itself seemed to tremble with the weight of their vow. The square trembled in the echo of the sheriff's words. But silence never stays long in a place where power is contested. And from the edge of the crowd, a rancher, with a face like weathered stone, shoved forward, his voice sharp and bitter. "You think you've won?" he barked, jabbing a finger at the mothers and children, his eyes flashing with anger more desperate than righteous. "When the federal men ride through and hear of this defiance, they'll shut down this town, burn our homes, and take every child for themselves. You think the braid will be saved then? No, you're only making it worse." Murmurs rippled, fear spreading like smoke in dry grass, for everyone knew Washington's reach stretched longer than any sheriff's pistol, and the threat of federal reprisal gnawed at the edges of their courage. Some fathers shifted uneasily, gripping their wives' arms, whispering that perhaps it was better to surrender one child than see them all scattered. Some mothers tightened their shawls and pulled their little ones close, their eyes wide with doubt. The missionary seized on the moment, thrusting the scissors into the air as if they were a holy scepter, shouting, "Hear him! This law is bigger than Dust Haven, bigger than me, bigger than you! Defy it, and you doom every soul here!" The soldiers, uncertain, looked between the sheriff's pistol and the wavering crowd, their resolve trembling as badly as the lantern flames. Wicasa clung to his mother's skirt, his braid gripped in her fist, and for the first time he felt the fear not only of losing his hair, but of losing his entire world, his neighbors breaking away one by one under the weight of the rancher's threat. Nape Wynn felt it too, the fragile unity fraying, the tide turning back toward obedience, and in that instant she did what no one expected. She lifted her son's braid high into the lantern light, her voice rising clear and fierce. If they burn Dust Haven, let them find this braid still uncut. If they take us, let them drag us whole. Better to be destroyed with dignity than to live shorn of it. Her words cracked the square like thunder, stunning the murmurs into silence, for they carried not only defiance but a truth each heart already knew, that surrender was never safety, only slower death. The blacksmith staggered forward, blood still seeping through the bandage at his shoulder, his hammer hanging heavy but his voice stronger than pain. "She speaks true," he cried. "What good is a home if it is bought by shame? What good is a town if it sells its children to fear?" His daughter stepped beside him, braids swaying like banners, her young face fierce as she shouted, "They will not cut mine!" And once more the children's voices swelled, the chant breaking through the smoke of doubt, weaving together until it filled the square with the sound of 100 braids unyielding. The rancher cursed, spitting into the dust, but his words were drowned beneath the rising tide, and even the soldiers looked away, ashamed to stand against such a storm. The sheriff lowered his pistol, his voice trembling but resolute as he declared, "No federal man will burn what we defend tonight." Wicasa's small hand slid into his mother's, his fear beaten back by the glow of pride. And in that moment the braid was not just a memory of his father, but a living banner of a people who had chosen dignity over despair. The missionary's face twisted into something feral as he realized the crowd was slipping from his grasp, his authority shredded by mothers' cries and children's chants, and with a howl he lunged from the wagon steps, scissors flashing like a dagger. Before anyone could react, his hand clamped onto Wicasa's arm, yanking the boy from his mother's grasp, the blade snapping open as if he would shear the braid by force in front of every eye. Wicasa screamed, kicking, his voice tearing the night with the same words that had begun it all. "Don't take my braid!" Nape Wynn surged forward, but the missionary shoved her back with surprising strength, his face red with rage, his spit flying as he shrieked, "This ends now! You will all submit!" The soldiers froze, caught between orders and conscience, but the crowd erupted. A swell of bodies pressing forward, their fury breaking at last into action. The blacksmith staggered through, his hammer raised high, his daughter at his side, her braids flying as she hurled herself at the missionary's wrist. The scissors clattered against Wicasa's hair, but cut nothing, the man's hand trembling too violently to finish. Mothers screamed, fathers shouted, and the chant that had been defiance became a roar that shook the square. "Don't take him! Don't take him!" The sheriff lunged too, his badge catching the lantern light as he seized the missionary's shoulder, but the man twisted, striking out wildly, the scissors slicing the sheriff's coat. For a breath it seemed blood would spill, the braid falling in the chaos. But then Wicasa himself, small and desperate, clutched his braid tight with both hands. Refusing to let it be torn away, his young body shaking but anchored like a root in stone. The missionary gasped, his strength faltering against the boy's wild defiance, and in that instant the blacksmith's hammer came down hard against the scissors, snapping the blades in two with a clang that rang like a church bell split. Shards of steel flew, one cutting the missionary's cheek, blood trickling as he staggered back, clutching the ruined handle, his face pale with shock. The crowd surged around him, voices blazing, soldiers lowering their weapons at last, their shoulders sagging as if relieved of a burden they no longer wished to carry. Nape Wynn dropped to her knees, wrapping Wicasa in her arms, his braid pressed between them, uncut, whole, still alive with the memory of his father. She lifted her head, her voice shaking yet triumphant as she shouted for all to hear, "You cannot kill a spirit with steel!" The words tore through the night, echoed by 100 throats until the square thundered with a vow no scissors could silence. The missionary staggered, bleeding, his authority broken, and as the sheriff tore the snapped blades from his hand, Dusthaven knew the struggle had reached its peak. The Braid had survived, but the price of defiance would echo long after the lanterns burned out. The square lay hushed in the wake of the broken scissors, the metallic clang still echoing in memory, as though the bell of Dusthaven itself had tolled a reckoning. The missionary, pale and bleeding, clutched his cheek with one hand and the shattered handle with the other, his chest heaving as the crowd pressed in around him, no longer fearful but fierce, their faces lit not by lanterns, but by the fire of defiance. The sheriff seized his arm and twisted hard, dragging him down the chapel steps and into the dust, his voice hoarse, yet carrying in the stunned silence. "This town will not be ruled by cruelty," he declared, "not by law that shames, not by steel that breaks what God himself made whole." The soldiers stood aside, their bayonets lowered, one even tossing his rifle into the wagon as if casting off a weight, his jaw tight with shame. The missionary shrieked that Washington would punish them, that wagons would return, that every child would pay for this rebellion, but his words fell like stones into water, rippling but sinking, powerless now. Nape Wynn rose slowly. Wicasa clutched to her breast, his braid swaying against her arm, uncut, unbroken, shining with the faint oil she had combed through it the night before. She lifted it high, her hand trembling, and the lantern light caught on the strands until it gleamed like a banner above the crowd. "This braid is not only his," she cried, her voice raw but steady. "It is his father's, it is mine, it is yours. Cut it, and you cut us all, but tonight it stands." The words crashed over the square, and mothers sobbed openly. Fathers bowed their heads. And the children, those with braids and those already shorn, lifted their voices in a chant that shook the walls of the schoolhouse until the boards groaned. "Don't take mine, don't take mine." The sheriff hauled the missionary toward the wagon, thrusting him up like a sack of grain, and with a sharp slap to the horse's flank, sent him rattling out of the square, his curses trailing behind like smoke dissipating in the night. No one followed, no one stopped the wagon, and no one looked away from the sight of the braid still held high. As the lanterns dimmed and the townsfolk drifted back to their homes, a strange peace settled. Not the peace of silence, but the peace of knowing a line had been drawn, and they had chosen to stand upon it. Wicasa leaned into his mother, exhausted, his voice small but proud. "It's still here," he whispered, fingering the braid. "He's still here." And she bent low, kissing his hair, murmuring, "Yes, my son, and as long as it remains, so are we." Dawn would bring questions, perhaps even punishment from far-off men who had never seen this square. But for that night, Dusthaven carried no fear, only the image of a boy's braid swaying unbroken in the arms of the mother who had refused to let it fall. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more soul-deep stories here on Echoes of the West. If you had been in Dusthaven that night, would you have stood with the mother when she raised her son's braid to the crowd?